The 244 GTK Skate Deck is officially live on GarageWelt.com. There's a link in the description. Go snag these right now before they run out because they are limited. But this one is going to a winner from last week's episode. I'll tell you who it is at the end of this one, and we've got a second giveaway to tell you about, so you gotta stay tuned. But this episode is gonna be worth it. It's the best one in a long time. This thing is finally ripping, it's running right. We've got dyno pulls, we've got horsepower figures, we've got a burnout. This is it, it's what we've been waiting for years. But first we gotta get it running right, so let's do it. In our last episode, we finally got the Model A out on the street and driving for the first time in a couple of years, and that's a huge milestone, but a number of you correctly pointed out that it's not running very well. We'll get that sorted out on the dyno, but first we've got to get some baseline work sorted out because this thing barely wants to start as it is. So we've got some troubleshooting to do, but for once, instead of fabrication, we're going to dive under the hood. The Model A runs on a Haltech Elite 2500 standalone system, and that gives us complete control over every single facet of the way that it runs, or at least it gives someone control, and that someone is Andrew Molina from Animal Auto. He's the mastermind that has tuned our K-swapped Ferrari, and now he'll work his magic on this supercharged Coyote-swapped Ford Model A. And first on the list is getting this thing to fire up correctly. So headphone users, you've officially been warned.
Is it
it's the loudest fuel pump you've ever heard.
Let's put that to the test. Oh, how do I work this thing?
And let's get it out of the way. I know the fuel pump on this thing is obnoxious. It's insanely loud. But that comes with the territory of an insanely capable fuel pump, so you're just gonna have to put up with it just like I do. So clearly this thing doesn't want to fire. And although Andrew is putting all the fuel he can in for startup, something is amiss. So we need to start with the basics, and step number one is to pull the plugs for inspection. It comes as no surprise after Andrew's addition of fuel for startup that these things are drenched in fuel. In other words, it's a flood condition. That means we've got our first fix on the list.
So right now what we're going to do is we're going to clear out the engine because it seems like the plugs were wet. We're going to turn off the fuel and crank it over, and if there's any residual fuel in the cylinders, we're going to clear it out and go from there and see why it's not wanting to fire up and take a gander at what we have here.
And while all the spark plugs are out, it seems smart to check compression across all of our cylinders just to be sure. This is a brand new crate engine, so it's unsurprising, but we've got 180 across the board. So we can cross any compression issues off the list and start focusing on smaller details. The next step was to gap down our spark plugs to 20 thousandths. There's a lot of ways to skin a cat, but this is an opportunity to showcase a tool, and this one's a new one for me, a spark plug gapper. Is it necessary? Not at all, but it's a pretty trick way to make sure your gaps are perfect without slamming your spark plugs against the table. With everything reassembled, it's time to test firing it up once again, while also dealing with some low voltage problems due to such a small battery. It can only handle so many starts.
10.5. 11 point something, yeah. I hate to say it, it's probably not going to fare well. I'll give it a shot though. There you go.
Clearly, we're not there yet, but Andrew spent a bit of time in the Haltech software, did a bit of what I would call hacking the mainframe, and finally got some of the kinks worked out. I don't have the technical explanation, but he got this thing firing up just fine. For better or worse, though, that only brings us to the next issue we have to solve, and that was realizing we're only running on 7 cylinders. Cylinder number 1 is completely cold to the touch. Now thankfully, we know it's got compression, so it's likely related to electronics in some capacity.
So Misfire diagnosis, what we're going to want to do is check a couple things that are going to cause the cylinder to fire. You have your coil pack, the spark plug, and the injector. And of course the wiring to actually make this all happen. Going over everything, I'm looking at this pin here, and this pin looks like it's not, like the tang is kind of almost flattened out. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna depin that pin and try to like move that prong back out so it has a good contact on the injector. Me manually grabbing the injector and touching it to battery, I do hear a physical click, so I'm under the assumption that the injector is actually okay. But moving around coil packs, moving around spark plugs didn't get a response, but I do not get an audible change when I kill this cylinder, when every other cylinder does have an audible change. So a deep dive would be, let's check the pins next. Let's go from there.
And of course, Andrew called it exactly. One of the pins on this injector connector was a bit bent out of shape. A quick attempt to fix the pin itself didn't quite work out, so we pulled the connector apart and replaced the pins entirely. Everything else checked out, so it was time to fire it up and make sure our fix worked. And by plugging in and unplugging cylinder number 1, you can hear the difference. So now we've got a proper startup procedure and we're running on all 8 cylinders, and that is some meaningful progress. The IR gun shows that everything checks out, and on the software side of the equation, Andrew is largely happy with everything he sees, but there are still some fixes we need to execute. And so at this point, we're going to have to get out the tools because Andrew has given us some homework. Our first fix is this thing. And if you're wondering what this thing is, it's a fuel pressure gauge mounted to a brass pipe affixed to my fuel pressure regulator. And I chose to set it up this way initially because, well, it's kind of a hot rod and I thought it looked cool. But eventually, the brass will crack and spray fuel all over my exhaust manifold, and that is not desirable. On top of that, we're now running on full standalone instead of a factory-forward computer, and so we'd like to see exactly what our fuel pressure is at all times. And so today, the brass comes off, as does the gauge. We're converting to a much more modern fuel pressure sensor. Now, for those of you wondering why we might want a digital sensor instead of a gauge that we can't see from the driver's seat, the idea is that our Haltech 2500 can compensate for any fuel pressure issues that we encounter and let us know if there's an issue to begin with. We're going to replace the brass fitting with an NPT plug for this port, and I'm using this LG 188 thread sealant instead of Teflon. I've been using this stuff on everything lately, and so far I haven't had a single leak, so if you're looking for something similar, I've loved this stuff so far. With the old ports sealed up, we're now going to drill and tap the plug on the front side of our fuel pressure regulator so that we can install the sensor there, as there's a lot more room for ease of installation. Not to mention the fact that our wiring harness is already run to this point, which makes this whole install as simple as it gets. We will plug it in and go, no programming required because we're using a Haltech sensor as well. All that's left is to hook up our vacuum line for the vacuum or boost reference so that our fuel pressure adjusts with boost accordingly. We can cross this job off the list and move on to the next one, which is a mildly more difficult one to solve. On startup, we're getting a lot of smoke. Normally, this would have me stressing big time, as though there's some major issue inside the engine, but it's new and we know that's not the case. Instead, it's a result of us changing these valve covers and having an improper catch can setup. Now, in order to get this smoke situation solved, I want to put a catch can onto this truck. There's clearly not much room to do that anywhere, but I've ordered up a tiny one that we're going to mount to the firewall right behind this valve cover, which means we need to plumb these valve cover outlets to that catch can, and then that will sort everything out. Problem solved. But there is still a problem to deal with. These guys thread into the valve cover, which makes a whole lot of sense, and if you look at the way that it threads in, you would think, oh, that must be a -8 ORB fitting, because it looks exactly like one, and it's the same size as one, and it uses an O-ring, but it's not. Somebody took this fitting, and instead of making this billet fitting have AN threads, they gave it metric threads. Nothing else uses that. This is an 18x2 O-ring fitting. I cannot put into words how frustrating that is when literally every aftermarket accessory ever for any sort of oil lines is going to use AN. And it's literally the same size. It's just a thread difference. This is insane. This should just thread on here and work. And technically speaking, you could probably like cross-thread it in there, but we're not going to do that. Instead, now we've got to take the long way around the barn. I'm going to cut this up. I'm going to cut this up. We're going to weld all this stuff together and give ourselves AN fittings so we can run AN lines to our catch can. And having to do this is really stupid. This is really dumb. I don't like it. Whoever did this, you should get fired. Simple as that. I'm sorry for the rant, but hopefully looking at these fittings, you can understand why I think this is so utterly silly. This is a completely avoidable problem if someone somewhere had, I don't know, used their head. But instead, we've got to cut apart some fittings to make some new ones because there's literally nothing on the market available that will thread into these valve covers, and that is completely absurd. Now, to clarify what I'm actually doing here, I'm cutting apart the original hose barbs that came with our valve covers with M18 threads on them, and only keeping the threaded section. The threaded section will get welded to -8 male AN fittings, which will ultimately allow us to connect hoses to the valve covers and a catch can to the other end of the hoses, completing our catch can system. The catch can itself is meant to catch oil vapor instead of recirculating it through the engine, which is what's currently causing our exhaust smoke. So let's weld up some fittings because that is what's first and foremost on our list. Don't forget, if you want to support the channel and all of the work that Anthony and I pour into these episodes, head over to the Patreon and subscribe. We'll give you behind-the-scenes looks at what's going on, a preview of our upcoming project, and we're always participating in the Discord private lounge. All right, and just like that, snap our fingers, we've got fittings that should work as long as they didn't distort. I think they look pretty good. The flange on these was not very big to kind of get a nice low profile weld, but they're fine. They look okay. I wish they were black. They're going to kind of stick out. Maybe we'll throw some paint on them later, but for now, let's get this job done. Let's install these things and start making some lines. As hoped, the new fittings thread into the valve covers without a hitch, so we can cross those off and move on to the catch can itself. I ordered up the smallest vibrant catch can with plans of mounting it just behind the passenger side valve cover, but after receiving it, I realized there's not as much room here as I thought, and I'm not happy with the way this is going to look. Even mounting it behind the supercharger itself feels clunky, so we've got to come up with something different. I realized if we flip the mount, it gives us some alternative options, and because it's so small, maybe there's a way to fit it down in front of the engine underneath the hood. Mocking it up on some of the bosses of the engine block itself, it looks like it could work, especially if we cut up the original intake, because there's a lot of stuff here we don't need. We're not running a MAF sensor anymore because we're on the Haltech standalone, and we also don't need this shield that covers up the filter itself because we're not worried about MAF wash from the electric fans. MAF sensors usually need to be placed inside of a straight segment of tube so that they have proper airflow, but since we're not running it, we can shorten the intake tubing and therefore move the filter further up and gain clearance under the hood for the catch can itself. And hopefully you're tracking, because I know I just crammed a ton of information down your throats. For the visual learners, you can now see we have a ton more room to work with to mount the catch can and easy access to the two bosses on the cylinder head itself. Now we just have to make a bracket to locate the catch can where we want it to be and hope all works out. Now, while I'd normally use Fusion 360 and Send Cut Send for a bracket like this, we gotta knock this one out quick, so we're doing it the old-fashioned CAD way with cardboard. Dirty fingers make it really easy to leave an impression on paper so we know exactly what our bolt spacing will be, and so we can simply trace it with a pen instead of having to deal with measuring things out, using rulers or calipers, or making things complicated. This is the old-fashioned way to make a bracket, and it's how everyone should get their start. To make things look nice, I'm tracing some bits of round material to give us a nice radius on the outside. Just because we're doing this the easy way doesn't mean we don't want a product that looks good when we're done. Now, I will be the first to admit that I've never been truly proud of the way my fabricated brackets look. I can get the job done, but I never get those rounded edges perfectly shaped. My parts never really look like they were CNC machined. It always looks hand-built, but we're also always our own toughest critic, and I point that out to say that what you see here, you can do too. It just takes time and a bit of work to pull it off. And now, with a finished paper template, it's time to transfer it all over to metal. You guys know the drill. First, we'll trace it onto some 1/8" plate, we'll cut it out on the bandsaw, we'll punch some holes in it, and then we'll take it over to the belt sander and clean up the edges and try to make the shape at least somewhat presentable. For my garage warriors out there, surprisingly, this $150 Ryobi belt sander is still kicking and working 3 years after I bought it, so if you're looking for a cheap one, that one's it. There's a link in the description. After cleaning the edges and chamfering the holes, we've got to bend it on the brake, and in this case, it's a simple 90-degree bend. That gives us a good idea of how these parts will fit together, but it also means it's time to cut apart the factory mount, and it's always scary to hack something apart when you don't have the ability to replace it. You have to have absolute faith that this plan's going to work, and I may or may not be there. We're winging it, but I feel loosely good about it. Our custom bracket needs one final cut at a very specific angle in order to pitch the catch can over to clear the hood. We could have taken a guess on this, but I figured the safest bet was to wait until everything was bent to shape, cut it, tack it together one time, and test it on the car. We want to make sure that everything clears the way that it should, because otherwise this could be a disaster. I can't count how many times I have fully finished welded parts only to realize I miscalculated and they don't fit. Using some small clamps, I'm holding our parts together, we'll throw a few tack welds on, and confirm the fitment before everything gets finalized. Thankfully, everything fits on the first try, so we're going to go on and fully finish weld it. Some of you might wonder why I'm going with a butt weld instead of a lap weld, and honestly, it's because I think it's going to turn out a little bit better and a little bit stronger, although it might not be as pretty. No one's going to see this part once it's installed, so if you guys don't tell, I won't tell, and we'll call this good enough. If you had asked me at the beginning of the build if there was any room for an accessory like this under the front of the hood, I'd have said no way, but this thing is in place. Let's call it done. But we still have to attach hoses to it. This thing originally came with Dash 10 fittings, and I need to swap them out for these smaller Dash 8s in my left hand. We use straight fittings to go into the catch can and 90-degree fittings on the bungs that we welded earlier, and we'll use braided stainless hose between them for the breather lines. Now, it's my hope that everyone that actually watches this channel enjoys all of the information and explanation I try to pack into every episode, but for this segment, I'll spare you. I've done enough AN line assembly on this channel to suffice for the rest of time. In fact, I've got an AN line assembly video that you can click up in the corner if you really want to know how it's done. In this case, we're threading some fittings together and keeping it simple with classic rubber line. The only new tidbit that I have for you is that it's important to ignore the fact that I'm using a steel wrench instead of an aluminum one, because it will make both of us happier in the end. This first tube closely follows the intake pipe so that it can pass through the same hole in the hood to reach the catch can. During assembly of the second line, I was reminded of a tip that I think I forgot to include in that AN video, and that's what to do when your line is pushing out during assembly. I like to take a piece of tape and wrap it around the base of the hose end. Leave essentially no gap so that there's no visible braiding. From here, once it's assembled, you'll be able to tell by looking at that gap if the braided hose is pushing out of the fitting while you're assembling it. It's not a common problem, but it does happen, and it's a helpful way to identify it, although you want to make sure that you don't have any more than about an 1/8 inch of pushout. Anything more, and it's worth disassembling and reassembling to prevent this entirely. This hose's routing is a little bit more complicated. It's got to go underneath the snout of the blower and then cross over and under the intake. And I'll admit, the plumbing on this thing is a little bit of a mess. It's not how I'd normally do things, but I think that it kind of works with the style of the truck, and I think trying to make something that is too clean and crisp would just kind of be out of place. So I'm embracing the chaos for this one. I think it works just fine. The hood isn't the straightest panel anymore, but I think this works out well, and it clears the catch can, all of the plumbing works, and overall I think this is a visually non-invasive way to accomplish what we wanted to do, especially considering there's just nowhere to hide anything on this car. Now let's turn our attention to one final piece of the puzzle before we can go over to the dyno, and that's addressing some issues with my fuel injectors. Now, I am not a smart man, so that means I let E85 sit in the fuel rail of the Model A for 2.5 years, and it just about ruined these ID injector dynamics injectors, and so we needed to send these out and get them cleaned, get them flow tested, because as I've said multiple times, the last thing I want to do after redoing everything on this truck is to blow this motor up. And having an injector be all messed up or gummy or dripping because of E85 is a very real and easy way to do it. But we picked these up from RC Injector over in Torrance. They have checked them out. They were not good. They are perfect now. We're gonna get them installed, one step closer to dyno time. And that highlights one of the benefits of living in Southern California, and that's that there's somewhere competent to clean these injectors right here in town. I was able to drop them off and pick them up the next day, complete with a full data analysis and flow sheet to know that these things are good and we can lean on them to make all the power we want to. Installation is a breeze on this thing since we have access to the motor, and after priming the fuel system, we got this thing firing up exactly as it should. At the same time, we'll burn off the oil for one final start, and from here it should be smooth sailing. I think it's time to get this thing over to the dyno. With the Model A loaded up, it's finally time to head to the dyno, and if you've known this project through the years, you know that I've yet to have a single dyno session go according to plan. In fact, it's been absolute hell every time, but I feel relatively good this time around. After parking the truck and trailer down the street, I drove the Model A down to Animal Auto, pulled it inside, and it's time to let Andrew do what he does best. Clearly, it needs some work to make it run right, because as it stands, it doesn't run worth a damn. But thankfully, we're at the right place. Once again, it's Animal Auto, run by my good friend Andrew Molina. If you're unfamiliar with his shop and his work, he primarily focuses on Skylines and GTRs, but if it's got an engine, he can make it run beautifully, and that's why we're here. Not only is he a pro with the Haltech standalone systems, he also works for the brand, which means he's got the technical resources to solve any problem we want to throw at him. So for the uninitiated, let's talk about what it is we're actually dynoing. The engine in this thing is a 5-liter Ford Illuminator SC crate motor, essentially a Coyote with forged internals topped by a 2.7-liter twin-screw blower. Andrew gave us a thumbs up regarding all of the homework he assigned to us, and so now it's time to hook this thing up to his hub dyno. To pull that off, not only do we have to remove the center lock wheels, we have to remove the center lock hubs too. Last time we were at Animal Auto, a number of you asked why we're using a hub dyno versus a chassis dyno, which you typically see on other channels where the car sits on top of rollers. A hub dyno like this is actually a more accurate way to measure power output as it removes variables and it's also safer for the operator. We don't have to strap this car down because it simply can't go anywhere. With the monolay bolted to the dyno, it's time to start the tuning process. Andrew's checked everything out, and it looks like we're good to go. With that said, I'm going to give one final warning. This thing peaks out the microphone no matter what we do. Even the lowered volume clips of this thing are hard to listen to, but I know you guys will be disappointed if I don't at least include some clips. So, final warning, proceed with caution, turn your volume down, whatever.
No, I know. My whole body is like shaking right now. Like, not from nerves. It's just like that was like. Let me tell you how much throttle I was in. I was scared to go full throttle. Put it that way.
Oh, sorry, I probably shouldn't have killed that.
It's all right. It's all right. There's nothing that you can do that piss me off, Mike. Just know that. Fucking love you.
Yeah, we got that.
So, surprisingly, that was pretty good. 12 pounds of boost, because it hits 12 pounds and it kind of stays there. But yeah, it looks like I was 96% open. That it was a little lean. That's why I was like a little skeptical to go in it, but not by much. 12.5 when I wanted an 11.8. So let's some quick easy math on this one. Let's put 6% into it, 8% into it. Let's just call it a day. And oil pressure was at a rock solid 90 the whole time. Fuel pressure. Let's watch our fuel pressure here, because we're kind of running out of pump. Because in theory, as manifold pressure rises, so should the fuel pressure, 1 to 1. But 51 psi, and we're dwindling down to like 46 at the top. Like it is on a downward trend. So if we go to trace views, right here we have our expected in blue, and we have our actual in red. But almost 666 horsepower. It's a pretty gnarly number. 666 horsepower, but we're gonna definitely get some power in it if I'm only at 12 degrees.
Okay.
I don't see that you have any knock sensors, unfortunately, or they're not turned on. Do we have knock sensors on?
So everything's looking good, but we have a fuel pressure issue. And that's something we need to solve, because a lean condition could melt this motor down in a heartbeat. The initial assumption is that there's some physical limitation causing the issue in our fuel system that we need to solve. So there's a little bit of fuel cell foam kind of particulate in this small filter, which isn't ideal. It could be part of our fuel pressure issue. Probably not the real likely issues. This filter is so tiny for what we're trying to do. Thankfully, Andrew's got an alternative sitting here, a huge radium filter, which Radium makes some awesome stuff. We've been trying to work with them for a while, so it's a good opportunity. Not even sponsored, but they make good stuff anyways. We're gonna see if we got the right fittings, can set this up, kind of mock it up on the car for now. We'll make a mount for it once we get back to the shop. Given that we have new fuel cell foam in our fuel cell, it's unsurprising we're seeing a little bit of particulate in the filter, but our greater hope is that we're removing a restriction from the fuel lines itself. I didn't have a problem here in the past, but hopefully this makes a fix.
Let's see if we got our fuel pressure in order. Let's also...
Unfortunately, even after just firing it up, it was clear that this didn't solve the issue. There's something else at play here causing a fuel pressure drop. In fact, it was worse now than it was just moments ago. Looking back at it while I'm editing, it starts to become clear what the problem might be, but I'll leave you guys guessing just as we were at the time. The next move was to continue with simplification. The fewer variables that were present, the fewer questions we were able to ask. So we're still seeing some fuel pressure drop during our pulls, which is not ideal. We're trying to figure out where it's coming from. Right now, we're gonna simplify the system. We're gonna bypass our lift pumps and our water separation filter and just go directly to the tank so that we can eliminate a lot of variables, make sure that that's the issue, and then I can revise back at the shop if we confirm that's what it is. And if it's not it, then we start looking elsewhere, but that's where we're gonna start. Some of you may remember that the fuel system on this truck is quite complicated. It's got a pair of pumps to lift fuel out of the fuel cell. They're passed through a water separation filter and then into a high-pressure inline pump, one more filter, and then up to the fuel rail. By removing the lift pumps and the first set of filters, we can remove a lot of variables. At this point, there's one pump and one filter before the fuel gets to the front of the truck. But with some of the old systems looped out, we wanted to take the opportunity and do a bit of exploration. We cut apart the primary fuel filter just to confirm whether or not it was full of fuel cell foam particulate. If some got through to the small filter, we expected to see some here, but it was perfectly clean. So with the simplified system, it was time for another pull. Let's see if it worked. Unfortunately, that didn't do the trick either. Our fuel pressure is still tapering off as the run progresses. But we did find another issue, and that's that our voltage isn't quite where it should be. In an ideal world, we'd be seeing 13.5 volts while the truck is running, but in reality, we're only seeing a little over 12, and it could be that this voltage issue means the pump doesn't have the amperage required to deliver enough fuel and keep the fuel pressure up. Yeah, well, let's see if having this thing on somehow makes more pressure,
let's give it a crack.
Just in case.
That's a big-ass Norco battery.
That's the one that'll start like a 10-liter diesel. That's why I bought it. Now, it's worth noting that I'm not showing every run we made through the day, just the ones that represent milestones as we made forward progress in diagnosing the car. Ignoring the fuel pressure issue, everything else was operating flawlessly. The truck was making lots of power, and everything was looking as it should.
Able to make a pass, and I kept it together just by putting fake numbers in it, putting more fuel in it. But
Battery didn't help.
Still at 12.2 battery voltage. We should be at 13.5. Fuel pressure is still dwindling down. Trace view, it seems like just a fall right there at 42, and it won't go less than 42.
So to summarize, we can work through the issue, but it's not the right way to do it, and ultimately we're under the impression that our alternator is not functioning correctly. With more voltage, the pump should kick up and should provide more than enough fuel for the application. But with some temporary Band-Aid fixes, we made some more pulls and got some official power figures. All right, so there you have it, 757.83 horsepower. It's a pretty good number.
It's a pretty respectable number, to
pretty
say
sick.
the least.
On, what did we say, 13 PSI?
Yeah, 13 PSI.
So, big pulley. We're not asking a lot of this motor. These things make well over 1,000 at the wheels all day long, but we're keeping it safe. I want this thing to last, not only while I have it, but for whoever has it next. And if one of you guys buys it and you want it to make all the power in the world, throw a smaller pulley on it. I don't care. I'm pretty stoked on it. We've got some alternator issues to solve. Other than that, I think it's down to just the final details, make it drive nice, paint what needs to be painted, clean it up, finish the small stuff, and then somebody buy this thing so we can start on a new project. That's what we really need. So let's talk about what we've actually accomplished here. The Model A now fires up exactly as it should, and it runs beautifully. It's significantly more drivable than it ever was at any point in the past, ever since I finished this thing back in 2018. It kind of drives like a normal car should, at least for what you'd expect from a 757 horsepower 1931 Ford Model A custom hot rod with huge tires and no power steering and a NASCAR transmission, and yeah, you get the point. I wouldn't say this thing is daily driver ready in any capacity, but it is drivable. And on that note, I think it's finally time we take this thing for at least a quick rip up the street. And so I'd call that a huge success. As said, this thing now runs better than it ever has at any point in the past. This is a payoff of monumental proportions, and it feels like I've been working towards this moment right here ever since I started the project with a stock Model A all the way back in the beginning of 2018. But of course, the final question is, what about that burnout? Well, we got to get the truck back to the shop. And then I'll be honest, we also need to wait until it's the weekend and after hours, because the last thing I want is to get popped while we're having some fun. But in total transparency, I've been wanting to do a burnout in this truck literally for years. This entire project kind of builds up to this point right here. I know it's just a burnout, but I've been waiting for that forever. And I'm stoked you guys got to be here for it, and what a way to send this project off. So that's all I've got for this episode, but we still have to give away this 244 GTK Garage Welt skate deck. And it, along with the other 308 deck, are getting signed, and they're going to Speed_JH, who correctly guessed 757 horsepower exactly. There was one other correct guess, but they came in later. So you snooze, you lose. Speed_JH, send me an email, mike@StanceWorks.com. I'll validate your identity, and anybody else who thinks you're gonna get away with trying to steal these out from under him, I already know how to pull this off, so too bad. But if you wanna win something, as said, I've got another giveaway for this episode. It's a little silly, but I think it could be kind of cool, and that's one of the old dampers off of this Model A, this custom H&R damper. They were made just for this thing. I am going to put it in kind of like a shadow box, display box, make it really cool to hang on the wall with some cool lighting. It's kind of a concept I've been working on for the pistons that we're going to give away to our Patreon subscribers. If you want to win this thing, it's super simple. Just leave the best comment, the funniest comment, or the best reason why you think you should have this thing, whatever. We loved all the engagement from the last episode, so if you want this on your wall or on your desk or wherever you want to put it, or on your car if you're feeling weird and spicy, just leave a cool comment. With that said, thank you guys for watching. This episode was a ton of fun. I am thrilled that this thing truly is on the road to being finished. I know it's been a long time coming, but it runs, it drives. All that's left is the small details, and we're gonna get those knocked out for the final episode, and then it's time to sell it. So stay tuned. I'll catch you guys in the next one. We'll see you then. One final note for this episode, any in the past and any moving forward, it is very common to get scammed on YouTube when there's a giveaway or a contest, or just in general by having fake accounts reply to your comment saying that you've won. And typically they try to make it look like I'm the one telling you that. Check those comments. If it doesn't say StanceWorks and have the check mark, it's not me and you're getting scammed. If I'm announcing a winner, I will do it like I did in this video. I will tell you who won, or I will tell you how I'm going to announce that video. It will not be in reply to your comment. Protect yourselves, don't get scammed, be alert, be smart, and take care.